We're facing this problem where we can't enter longer text here because we're using this scan function for getting the user input. And this scan function doesn't really work if you're expecting input that consists of multiple space-separated words. And thus far in the course, we typically only got single words, a single number, or something like this. But here in this demo app, where we want longer text input, we can't really use scan. Instead here, we have to go for an alternative, slightly more complex solution to get the user input. We can use another package, buff.io, which you need to import, which exposes a new reader function. This is essentially a constructor function that will give us a value that will allow us to read user input. Now for that, we must pass an argument to new reader, an argument of type reader, which in the end simply describes to new reader from which source we want to read. And here we of course want to read from the command line, and we can specify that as a source by using the OS package, which you therefore also must add to your imports. And there we must access the stdin, the standard input variable that is exposed by this package. Standard input is simply your command line. So with that, we're creating a reader that listens on the command line. So we should store that reader in a variable, because now as a next step, we can use that reader to read the string that was entered by the user. And read string wants to know at which byte it should stop reading. So at which character it should stop reading, you could say. And here the byte where it should stop reading is this line break identifier here. That is a single character in the end, and that's where it should stop reading. Now what's important here is that you don't use double quotes here, but instead to specify such a single byte, such a single character, you could say, you need single quotes. Because that's actually a special value type in Go. It's a so-called rune, which in the end is a single character. So we could also have an A in there, for example, but here we need that line break. So that's where we want to stop reading. As a result, we'll get back the text that was read and also potentially an error if something goes wrong with reading that. Therefore, we should also add an if check and check if the error is not nil, so if we have an error, in which case here I will return an empty string as a default value. Otherwise, if we make it past this if check, we have the text, but this text will now still contain that line break. Therefore, we have to remove that line break from that text. We can do that with help of another package, the strings package, which also must be added to your imports. And these packages are all part of the standard library. This strings package exposes some utility functions for working with strings. For example, a trim suffix function, which I need here. This allows us to remove some text from the end of a string. And here I want to pass in my raw text, so this text here, which contains that line break, and I want to remove that. So the new text is the old text without that line break. However, we also need to remove an additional character, which is sometimes, but not always there. We need to remove this special character. Because on Windows, a line break is actually not created with just /n, but instead with /r/n. And therefore we must remove both. And with that, we then finally have the cleaned text, which we can return. So that's now the slightly more verbose approach we have to use to read longer text input. But with that, we should be able to save all that and again run the application to enter our title and then the content, like this. And as a result, we should then get this output here where we see the node title, learn Go, and then has the following content, and the content is then output here. And the content is output down there because in NodeGo, in this display method, we have 2 line breaks after content colon, and then we output the content. It might also make sense to have some line breaks after that value, so we can of course also add 2 line breaks here. Now if we run this again, we can say learn Go in depth like this, and we got this output. Now I just want to add some spacing here between my prompt and the user input, and we can easily achieve this by going to main Go, where we're getting that user input, and by changing print to printf here, so that the text I want to output is actually this value here, and then an extra white space. With that, we now have this white space here between the user input and the prompt, so that we can enter this like that. Yeah, that works.